I want to thank everyone for coming out today or signing into Zoom today so that we can hear and learn from our colleague, Dr. Shereen Holmes, who recently completed her doctorate degree at Arkansas State University in Jonesboro. Today, she's going to share research from her dissertation looking at multicultural teaching practices in K-12 education, particularly in terms of the intersection with school reform initiatives. And so I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Holmes. And Dr. Holmes, thank you so much for sharing your important research with us today. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you all so much. Thank you for that introduction. I appreciate it. It's still new for me. So again, sometimes when I hear Dr. Holmes, I'm like, who's that? I'm like, oh, it's me. Um, so if I don't respond to it, or if I look confused, it is still a new title for me. But anyone that knows me know I'm still Shereen. I'm fine with Shereen. So I appreciate it. And thank you all so much for first of all, coming, we were just talking about how this is a very busy time of the year. I'm trying to get the last few courses in before the semester and graduation
No, I can't see you.
on deck as well. So, if you all came here, I appreciate your time and energy, and you wanting to step into me presenting this research the first time since I've defended. So, I hope that my labor of love the last 4 years is insightful, and is an opportunity for us to just reflect on the field of education. A little bit about my research and the research I did around my dissertation. So I wanted to look at in this research school reform initiatives and multicultural teaching practices, specifically in the K-12 education settings. I'll talk a little bit about how I got there, but I really became interested in school reform and multiculturalism, and then how does that impact the classroom, right? If there was a relationship between school reform and multiculturalism practices that are being implemented in the classroom today, and then what relationship they had. So just some background information that kind of led to this discovery, or led to looking at this topic, right? Thinking about the school populations within the United States, we see that they've become so diverse, from some of the populations that have been in the past. Specifically, I wanted to look at when these reform actions were happening, right? What was the school population then? And then how has that changed to the school populations that we have now? So right now in the United States, and this is recent as of 2022, they've seen an increase, specifically among a number of populations, but specifically this research looked at the Hispanic population, um, going from 22 to 28%. And even though that number may not look statistically significant there, if you look at statistics, if you think about statistics, that could be a couple of thousand, right? So growing that population from 22 to 28% can be a significant jump in the diversity in population, specifically among the Hispanic population of students. And from 2010 to 2020, there were statistics that came out that said there was a 276%, that's from 9 million to 33.8 million increase in the US multiracial population. So these are students that identify as more than one, as a part of more than one racial group. So there was a huge boost in those students that identified themselves in schools. And then, despite seeing all of this diversity, we also saw that the diversity declined among teachers. And so, thinking about these numbers, thinking about how student populations have changed, I really wanted to look at what students are expected to learn in schools, right? And how reform has stepped in, has kind of given voice to what students are learning in the classroom. And then how is that pairing with the cultural diversities that we saw? So this infographic just kind of shows, and I'm sure things have changed since then. I tried to find the most latest one, but I think they might be trying to go through a whole new state standards thing, which is why some of the research on state standards and what states are using is changing. But this infographic just kind of shows who's adopted what state standards, because these state standards came as a result of reform. And so this is what students are expected to learn in the classroom. And as we can see, many schools are still using Common Core state standards. Some states have kind of adopted them. So there's a partial adoption for some states. And then we have states that have not identified as using Common Core state standards at all. But these state standards are driving what students are learning in the classroom, and the types of information that they're getting in terms of curriculum. So to help students make these connections between their culture and the classroom, we lean a lot into multicultural approaches. We all kind of heard of the battle between critical race theory and the classroom. There's also the 1619 project that had came out. And the back and forth that there has been between implementing it and not implementing it. We see culturally relevant pedagogy stepping into the classroom. And so I really wanted to know, what is the relationship, right? Going back to this infographic, understanding that Common Core or whatever the state standards usually drive the instruction in the classroom. But then where does multiculturalism live, right? And is there a relationship that can be paired with the two to not just make this conversation about a cultural approach to learning, but a approach to learning that embeds the culture of students in the classroom, right? How we're taking those standards and making sure we embed them in the multicultural representations that students bring. And so the second line here, one powerful way to support multiculturalism as part of instruction is to ensure that those governmental supports that reform what the government is pushing in terms of standards and what our students need to learn is a part of the multicultural curriculum, and if there was a relationship between the two. So, for my study, I really wanted to focus on the biggest education reforms that have happened in the United States. And so that was the No Child Left Behind Act of 2001, which later became the Every Student Succeed Act of 2015. There was some reform done around that. And I really wanted to focus on these two in particular because these two reform policies had the biggest impact of the education system that we see today. As a matter of fact, we see fragments of the 2001 No Child Left Behind Act. We still see fragments of those in the education system, the K-12 education system today. So those are the two reform policies that I wanted to look at and what came out of those policies to help push multiculturalism and think about how that is seen in the classroom. So in looking at that, these were my research questions, right? The first question, I really wanted to know what educational reform initiative mandates, how do they impact, right, the classroom? And how did that implementation impact multicultural teaching practices? And then the core components of multicultural teaching practices, how are they effectively supported in implementation with the classroom? So that second question really looked at some multicultural approaches, big picture. So not looking at specific curriculums, but looking at the big picture core components of multicultural teaching, and then how is that supported in the classroom? The third question was how does federal, legislation support the work of cultural relevancy in the classroom? So again, looking at those two reforms, Every Student Succeed, and the No Child Left Behind Act of 2001, and thinking about where cultural relevancy meets those two reforms. And then the last question is, what parts of current educational mandates in the United States don't align with multicultural teaching practices? This one became interesting to me because part of why my drive and part of why I wanted to do this was as a instructor with the City Teaching Alliance. We often hear, and I know my colleagues who, who also teach have heard this, well, I can't do this because, right? We approach and we ask our participants in our program specifically to identify cultural relevancy pedagogy tasks that they can do in the classroom. And we will often get the pushback, I can't do that in my school, right? Or I have to stay on Common Core state standards, or I have to do this specifically. And so I really wanted to see, well, if we're asking students to do these use these multicultural teaching practices, is there some misalignment with the Common Core standards? Are there pathways that can be created if there isn't alignment to help support this multicultural teaching practices? So these are the four areas that I focused on in my research questions. And then from there, I came up with my, framework using some of the work from other scholars in the field. So this multicultural approach to classroom framework really thinks about if we are teaching multicultural practices, what does that look like? Again, one of the things I discover in kind of researching this and looking at different things is there's many different ways to approach it. But there were some common things that I saw among some of the curriculum that I looked at. So if we're thinking about multicultural approaches, we're looking at cultural responsiveness. And I'll toggle between this model and the next model that kind of talks about this, right? So if we're talking about culturally responsive components, that identifies the connection between the home connection and the culture of the student and the school culture, right? So sometimes when we're looking at curriculum, we may say, oh, just bring in your home connection, but we don't connect that to the work that's being done in the classroom, right? We may ask them to bring in a picture of their family, but then sometimes the connection isn't made to how that's supporting whatever the standard is. But when we look at multicultural teaching and we think about this multicultural framework, when we create those lessons, they really should have a culturally responsive component. And so they should connect the school, they should connect the home culture of the student and the work that they're doing in the classroom. There's also cultural synchronization. So again, this is the connection between the teachers and students, right? Particularly those students who come from multicultural backgrounds, so the different backgrounds that are presented there, and the strong support, right, that's given to those students, right? So this is identifying the approaches that align with the students and then their cultural connections, right? How is it culturally synced to the students as they're learning? There's also developing a cultural diversity knowledge. And Geneva Gates talks a lot about this, that the teacher becomes familiar with the cultural norms of the students, that they know who the students are that are represented there. And when you're building multicultural learning, curriculum, this is a key component to it, that the teacher knows their students, they know their cultural approaches, they know why a student may respond. We talk a lot about this in some of our math courses within CTA. If a student represents a number a certain way, right, that may be different from ours, how is that maybe more of a cultural approach as opposed to the student not knowing the curriculum or misinterpreting the curriculum, right? So the teacher has a cultural connection or knowledge base to their student. Then there's also designing culturally relevant curricula. And so this is developing the curricula that supports the work of cultural relevancy. How are we designing lessons? How are we designing connections between the standards and those lessons in there? And so all four of these components make up this multicultural approach to the classroom. This is how these lessons are designed. This is how these lessons are put together. And so for the purposes of this research, these were the different areas that I wanted to look at in relationship to reform, education reform, and what happened in education reform helped to support these different areas of building a multicultural approach in the classroom. And I know I'm talking, so if questions arise, please be sure to drop them in the chat. I did kind of leave some time for questions towards the end. So if I'm talking and talking too fast or you need me to clarify, please let me know. Okay. So in addition to, looking at the classroom, looking at those reform approaches, I did a little research, right? Where has history taken us in terms of education? One of the places I really wanted to start was thinking about how education started specifically in this country, right? And so Thomas Jefferson often in a lot of the early years of research in terms of education was often quoted as the father of modern education here in the United States, right? As education was known here. But if we think about that time, right, and in my research, one of the things that I saw was that was the late 1700s, right? And so in that time, we know that there were many different groups not represented in the education system. We had during that time African Americans who were still enslaved. Women were not a part of the education system. There were certain classes that were not a part of the education system. And so when we think of education and the structure that it was built on, around, giving access to those who may not have been a part of a certain class of folks, we know that there's even more groups of folks that were not represented in education. And so that goes to the design, right? Who is it designed for? Over time, we kind of saw education evolve. We saw the advancements of the different representations of folks that are represented here, our BIPOC population. We saw how women became more involved in the education system. And so thinking about all of these inequalities that were changing over time, that were showing us how many different people are now being represented in the education space, my question was it enough, right? Was access enough? Or was there more work that needed to be done around making sure that they were represented in the work that they were doing? As time progressed, we saw President Lyndon Johnson, who signed one of the first bills. I didn't talk a lot about this in my research, but the Elementary and Secondary Education Act. So that was one of the first time we started to see funding go into the education system. And then from there, kind of thinking about how do we create a structure? There was a lot of back and forth. I didn't put it here in the slides, but just in terms of research, there was a lot of back and forth that went into creating the Department of Education. But one of the key things that I saw in my data was we started to see, specifically as we moved into the 2001 era, we started to see how money became a huge part of the promotion of education initiatives, and essentially what was being taught in the classroom. um, Money became a core component around like who got funds, why they got those funds, and what they wanted to see in the classroom as a result of those funds. So um, part of the push for the 2000, when we get to the No Child Left Behind Act of 2001, a big part of that became my focus in understanding why all of the reform that happened led us into this initiative that was so monumental in education. So 2001 happens, and President George Bush signs the No Child Left Behind Act. And this act became really important to my research because it was one of the first times that we saw some mandatory things happening in education. One of the core things that we saw was the accountability piece. We saw schools being held accountable for the content that was being taught. We saw this idea of high stakes testing come into the arena, and schools needing to meet these mandates. over time, right? We saw how the 2001 No Child Left Behind Act became um, very heavy on students meeting progress and changing the landscapes of schools. So in 2015, we then see the Every Student Succeed Act come up, and we see that crop up as an act now that was pushing students to keep some of those mandates, keep some of those testing requirements, but really giving states the option to make those choices. As opposed to the 2001 No Child Left Behind Act, when there was more federal involvement in that. Okay. This was the reform piece that I really wanted to get to in my research because, again, we hear from a lot of our participants that I can't do because, right? And part of that because is because their state or their district is still under some of this federal reform in terms of what they need to teach. I think we were talking a little bit before we started, and we were saying how our schools are now in testing. And so that's all we hear is testing. We're trying to act, as a matter of fact, my CTA community, we're trying to do independent observations, and we get, no, it's test, it's test, it's test, right? Everything is test. And so this still kind of drives some of what they're experiencing in the classroom and the teaching in particular that happens in the classroom. So I wanted to know that because I wanted to see what our teachers were up against when we're asking them to also implement this multicultural approach to teaching. So to find this out, to take all that research to find this out, I did a few interviews. And so I did ask both teacher so novice teachers, those individuals who had less than 5 years in the classroom, they're working in public schools, specifically the District of Columbia are the folks that I interviewed. They've also had some exposure to culturally relevant pedagogy. So these folks actually have taken courses around culturally relevant pedagogy. They've engaged in designing lessons around culturally relevant pedagogy. And then they're also using their state standards, and in this case, the District of Columbia, the Common Core state standards. So I conducted interviews with them. I also conducted interviews with clinical faculty members. So they've had more than 5 years of teaching. They work in a teacher preparation program that focuses on multicultural approaches to learning. They serve at the academia level and also have some coaching responsibilities. So they're able to see the clinical side of it as well as the academic side of the research. They themselves have also done some culturally relevant pedagogy research, and they were kind of spread across a couple of different places and states. And so in my interviews, whoops, I'm going backwards. I want to go forwards. In my interviews with those individuals, this was a qualitative study. So I conducted those interviews with each individual. And I really wanted to look at how, again, school reform impacted the connections that could be made or that were made with cultural relevant teaching in the classroom. Random sample. This kind of was just a little bit about, the sampling. It was random. There was an email sent out um, asking those individuals to contact me and if they wanted to be a part. From that, I got 6 participants who were interested. So 3 of them were novice teachers, and then the other 3 were instructors. These are the interview questions that were asked of them. So the top level of questions were the novice teachers. So again, those teachers who had less than 5 years of experience, but were in the classroom and implementing Common Core standards and also had some knowledge and also implementing some multicultural teaching practices to what they were doing. And then my teacher educators who were teaching those multicultural teaching practices. I'm going to pause here and kind of let you read. I know it's a lot to read. Let you read those questions and then we'll progress to the next slide. Okay. Whoops. All right. So, again, taking all those interview questions, disseminate that information, and this is just, high level stuff here. I really want to get into the data that I found from the research, but thinking about that, part of what I did with that information was pairing those and creating some themes, right? So I wanted to create themes around multiculturalism, like those areas. If we think about that framework that I showed you earlier, where did those areas pair with some of those school reform practices and initiatives, and then pair with my research questions? So how did all of those align? Because remember, my goal was to see if there was alignment between those, and if there wasn't, what areas were lacking with those. So let me just kind of get to, I want to skip through some of these. Oh, I do want to talk about this. So um, remember, for my research questions, I was able to kind of develop some themes, right? And how these questions then became part of themes around cultural relevance and syncing those in lessons. So relating to student lives and experience came up as a theme, how lessons and those components are a part of that. Alignment with state standards. So how does multiculturalism and some of the approaches in multiculturalism align with some of those state standards that the participants talked about? Cultural relevance and synchronization of lessons. So how does cultural relevance sync with the lessons? The teacher responsibility in creating meaningful connections, evaluation of success and achievement, and then considering the student's perspective and needs came up as themes from the responses of the participants. So I have a lot here on the screen, but if I could, if you want to know like where to draw my eyes or where to draw to the results, this last section that's in a different color from the other ones are actually the results. So from the framework element that I had, the theme that then was created, the research question, and these were the results. So for the first thing, when we think about cultural responsiveness, my research and the interviews that I did with participants show that the participants made connections that sought to connect the students to the classroom, and they noted specifically that it was essential that explicit cultural connections be made for students. This came up multiple times during this interview process. They noted that there needed to be connections made to the students. And so that cultural responsiveness piece came up strong as participants were answering this. And they also identified when it came to that knowledge base, they also identify that they would implement cultural responsive curriculums when they could establish a base with their students and understanding their cultural knowledge. So if they had the knowledge, they would take opportunities to make sure that they made those connections in the classroom for their students. They also talked about designing that curricula, right? So the participants identified that they felt it was their duty to make those connections, right? Not only within the curriculum, but also in their engagement piece. So times in the lessons or times in the day where maybe they weren't teaching the curriculum, they also made sure that they wanted to make that engagement piece for students as they were in the classroom and as they were connecting to the work. When it came to cultural synchronization, both the teacher and the educators did state that they had strong beliefs about the perspectives of their students who were in the classroom. So they talked about strategies that would lead to teachers getting to know their students, their personal lives, understanding those, right? How they could use that work to help support them as they were teaching in the classroom. And then during the interviews and also looking at some of the research, another thing that came up was this modern education, American education as we know it. The shifts and the goals and the agendas of the federal government most certainly, as you all know, impacted what students learned in the classroom, right? So thinking about where students or participants wanted to go, thinking about some of these shifts that they wanted to make to the curriculum, keeping in mind though that school reform had an impact, and had an impact in their ability to implement those. One thing that I didn't put on the slides, but that came up a lot in the interviews that I did, was having that desire to make those cultural connections, wanting to make those cultural connections, but not having the time. So as time was slipping away, as all again these shifts in the agendas and the goals of federal government were impacting students, they did note that they just didn't have the time to devote to making sure that they were doing this cultural synchronization, or they were designing that, unless they themselves took that initiative on above their work. So from that, some of the conclusions that I drew, and some of the ways that I kind of talk through, like how do we help to make those connections stronger in the classroom, centered around how do we incorporate this multiculturalism? Because again, we saw, and from the research we see that education reform is driving what students, what teachers are doing a lot in terms of instruction in the classroom. And though teachers have this desire to bring that work into the classroom, again, whatever the agendas are and whatever the structures that federal reform has done to set us up for the standards that teachers are being taught, that is what's driving a lot of what's happening in the classroom. So one way that I kind of concluded from all of the research, was having these student cultural affirmations, right? The curriculum that students are being taught should affirm their culture. It should acknowledge them as the primary source, and this is from some of the research that Gloria Latson Billings has done, right? How is it acknowledging the students' culture? Is there rigorous, culturally engaging instruction, right? Classrooms that are successful with this are also pairing not just the cultural pieces, but also rigorous instruction to help support students as they are moving through their lessons, and then providing multiple pathways of learning. So making sure that we're identifying and approaching students different levels of intelligence as they're walking through learning and assessment. Um, so, um, some suggestions, right, from my research that I came up with was the observation and the evaluation. A big part of my research showed that the standards that we have for students that are set up, they're tied to some type of evaluation. So students do work all year long, and then there's an evaluation of how those students have done with that content. So the same thing should happen with multicultural teaching, right? That there's an observation system, that there's an evaluation system, that teachers are being weighed on in terms of their assessment, their knowledge of multicultural approaches in the classroom to help support that, because that is a part of why state standards, that's also a part of why teacher evaluation systems are set up and supported. So including those dynamics could help strengthen the multicultural approach within that work. Also identifying new and cutting edge research around pedagogical practices and knowledge. So not just having teachers read about these different curriculums, but then having them sit in research, or having them sit and do some hands-on research, hands-on implementation of multicultural teaching practices will help best support them. And then establishing an assessment measure, not just with the teacher, but also with the student, right? So ensuring that as they're taking the assessments for the state, for example, or they're taking the assessment for their districts, they're also including measures of their multicultural understanding, or their multicultural knowledge base as part of the work that they're being assessed in. So yes, kind of fleshed out my recommendations here, right? So how do we meet some of those recommendations? So number one, developing standards, right? Developing multicultural standards, just like with the Common Core, because again, what's being taught in the classroom with the Common Core is all around whatever those standards are, or if they're not in the Common Core, if they're in Texas, for example, it's the TEKS, right? Those standards directly translate into what students are doing in the classroom. So developing standards, developing multicultural standards that unpack some of the work around what students should be doing, modifying some of those standards. I talked in my research about a book, Engaging in Culturally Relevant Math Tasks. One of my colleagues, Dr. Lou Matthews, is one of the authors on this book, and they talk a little bit about how we'll take those standards and we include language that involves love, that involves, different language components that rewrite the task or rewrite the standard to help support students in making those multicultural approaches. So thinking about language, thinking about processes that honor and respect multiculturalism in their implementation. Recommendation two is thinking about assessment measures. So I talked a little bit about this, right? How are we assessing multiculturalism in the classroom? And also taking these out of just the traditional pencil and paper portfolios, right? Student narratives, open-ended questions. How are we making sure that the approaches that we're talking about in multiculturalism are then being translated into the classroom, much like those from school reform initiatives. And then further training. So making sure teachers understand these multicultural practices, they're getting opportunities to implement them. They're, thinking about their teacher practices. And then this last one, naming barriers. I think this is also an important component, because again, this is often where we find that battle between implementing and not implementing, right? I want to implement it, and I talked a little bit about this and what some of my teachers said, or some of the participants said in the study. I want to do this. This sounds amazing, right? But these are the barriers that are preventing me from doing this. So creating a space for them to have a conversation around what those barriers are, and then how do we combat those barriers around implementing multiculturalism? I know I've talked a lot. Thank you all for listening to me talk a lot. But I did want to leave questions, comments, anyone want to raise?
Dr. Holmes, I want to say thank you. I thought your research and your presentation was really fascinating. So thank you so much for that. I do have a question, but I'm going to turn it over to Emily so she can ask her question and we can continue the discussion. Folks, feel free to raise your hand, to get acknowledged, to come off mute and ask your question, or post your question in the chat box. Emily?
Sure. Hi, Dr. Holmes. Thank you for sharing your work with us. My question is, in the interview process with both the teacher educators and the novice teachers, did you get a sense of what they named as the barriers? Were there consistencies when it comes to the barriers across, and were they specific in nature that we could drill down into how we can define them?
Yeah, a lot of them were around curriculum and curriculum choices. That DC in particular, that school district, they do have some scripted curriculum, and that's what they're being expected to teach. And so they didn't feel like, though there was some room for agency because it wasn't word for word that they had to say everything on the page, they felt like they needed to stay within those standards and those objectives in order for their students to be successful ultimately on assessments, and then drill down to time, right? Like, I want to do these things, but I have this much time in the day, and so now I have to pick and choose which one I'm going to leverage. And unfortunately, because there is no assessment measure, right, for multiculturalism, they're going to choose the one that has that assessment measure.
Tracy?
Uh-oh, we can't hear you, Tracy.
I really appreciated and had lots of questions along the way, but I'm going to just hone in on one and maybe we could follow up. I'm just so curious about the recommendations and your thoughts about how to develop a really authentic way to build the novice teachers or pre-service teachers and their instructors shared language and examples of what we're all looking for and talking about. So there was somewhere in there early about some kind of observation tool that would be looking in real time, and I appreciated that. I'd love to see if you came across anything or if there'd be any interest in collaborating on something, but that's just kind of that's the middle point, right? To put those pre-service teachers or novice teachers in a position to know intentionally that they're building those connections in their pedagogical choices, and then to give them kind of a mirror and have somebody else say, I see them, then to lead to improvement, is sort of, it's such a continuum. So I'm curious about if tools came up, and then I liked at the end though, you kind of reflected on bringing about perhaps some kind of portfolio assignment where it's not just a one observation, but more of an opportunity. So do you have any, or did you come across any examples, or would you be interested in collaborating on trying to develop some that would be appropriate for us in our shared work?
I would most certainly be open, yes, to that. I think, I personally haven't come across any. And actually, this was my chair, this was her push to me, was like, start to, look at that, start to look at those areas. So yeah, I absolutely would love that. I know, I've kind of seeing some approaches that incorporate not necessarily multicultural priests, but more of open evaluations or thinking about evaluation in different ways. I know Charlotte Danielson, I think that's her name. She's done some work around how to rethink this evaluation process. But yeah, I would most certainly love to think about like how that evaluation piece would look and have thought partners around designing that. Absolutely. Yep.
Dr. Holmes, one question that I had for you is I wonder, where do you see school leaders fitting into the dynamic that you're talking about? And one of the things that I often think of is that leaders create the context within which teachers feel as though they can push on particular curricular or instructional boundaries, right? As much as the policies at the federal or state or district level are constricting, there is some asynchrony there, right? And it's in that misalignment where we do find some gaps and opportunities to push. And so I'm just curious, how do you implicate leadership and leadership practices in either empowering teachers to say, here's how I can work in those gaps or those misalignments and find those opportunities to do this kind of work? And where do you find leaders are just not creating that? And would that make a difference? Is that an area that we need to work on as well, so that teachers can actually run with this in ways that it seems your research is showing that they want to?
Yeah, and that's a great point. For this research, I didn't consider them. But one of the things, in thinking about that is in my interviews, school leaders came up, right? Well, my school leader is going to come in and they're going to see me doing not this, right, but this, and then their voice rings the loudest, right? What my school leader told me to do. I think that a huge part of where like school leader and having school leaders connect to is two areas, actually: the research and that development piece. So them being a part of that research, because ultimately school leaders are also the individuals who make the determination around PDs. Who's going to come into my school, right? Who's going to come into my school and give information about these areas. And so having school leaders be a part of that research and that development for their practitioners and their teachers. I also think, going back to that observation and evaluation piece, like we might not be able to make a determination on the assessment, right? Because most states make those assessment, most districts make those assessment. But I absolutely think even if it's a line, right, or even if it's an area I know in certain school districts, they have these different boxes in different areas, right? Even if it's in addition to that evaluation piece to say, implementing multicultural or honoring student cultural like advancements and teachers being evaluated a part of that, I think that's absolutely a great way to kind of entry point into multiculturalism and how they're a part of the classroom. I absolutely think school leaders are key. My husband actually is a school leader. He was a principal for a couple years, and now he's an assistant principal in the county. And so, I always talk this multicultural, talk to him, and he's like, okay. I'm like, but no, they need to make sure they include. So yeah, I think that they are a key part of this as well.
Yeah, and I really appreciate how you made that connection to the evaluation process. Here in New York, we have Danielson, and I've often seen principals work through their own interpretations of Danielson, right? Again, finding those opportunities within the gaps or within the not as well-defined spaces. And so that does create opportunity, whether we're talking about their formal evaluations or their informal evaluations. So I think that's really fantastic, right? I can see, based on what you're talking about, leaders sort of cutting and being threaded through all of the three areas that you identified for recommendations. So thank you for that. Any other questions, comments, reflections, reactions to Dr. Holmes' work or research? Tracy, I know you said you had a few questions. Did you want to pose any others?
Sure. Well, I had I was curious, again, my head is so in pre-service, and I realized even as you were kind of giving your follow-up question, thinking about, and I used to be in Illinois where they use Danielson, so I'm familiar with that. But I really think we have an opportunity and an obligation in pre-service preparing to build a continuum and then not try and backpedal and try and think about righting wrong. So I'm curious about the teacher educators and the novices that you interviewed, and if you saw that I believe your data was a combination of their responses. Did you see differences in those who were in the teacher educator space and those who are this I'm doing it space and it's new and it's a lot space in terms of capacity building or concern or solution orientated, responses?
Yeah, there definitely was a difference. I think, for the teacher educators, so the novice, well, the novice teachers, let me start with that group. They definitely there was definitely a desire. They all talked about the need for this. And they all talked about needing this. Part of it may be because, and these particular teachers have been a part of, Urban Teachers, CTA. Part of it was we also pushed them on our rubric. So one of the factors that we have is the first piece of our rubric is, are you creating welcoming and nurturing environments, right? And we've evaluated them, and they've done it in coursework. So they all kind of talked about, yes, I need to do this, right? I think for them, one of the things that was happening for them is there was this battle between what I need to do versus what I have to do. Also in DC, there's a connection to pay as well, right? So if you score a certain way on your evaluation, there's a monetary component to that. And so they all wanted to do this work, desire to do this work. But they all kind of had these other competing interests going along. For our teacher educators, they've been in the research, right? Like they've done the research. Some of them are presenting on this research in different areas. So the level of flexibility and creativity, they kind of had more of a, oh, it can be done this way, right? Oh, it can be done this way. And so there was this discourse, which is part of one of my recommendations, I made the recommendation that we have to bring those components of accountability into the work that we're doing, right? Because again, and I own it and I acknowledge it, right? As a teacher educator, it's easy for me to say, "Oh no, you can do it this way,"
Yeah.
as opposed to like me walking in a classroom with a principal or a leader who's saying no, 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 or whole school culture who's just not focused on that. So there definitely was some difference. I think there was more like flexibility and optimism with the teacher educators versus the novice teachers.
I can see that.
Absolutely. Yep.
Yeah, thank you.
Yep.
Tokes?
Hi, can you hear me?
Mhm.
Sorry, I'm sick. So, there were a few things that I thought about. The first thing that, and a few people have talked about this. On one hand, we want this in the classroom, but at the end of the day, what trumps everything is how well the students are doing in the classroom. And so try to look at connections between, um, what we're talking about in terms of not just multicultural implementation and not just culturally responsible implementation, but a mindset that will also show that when you do this at the school or the district level, it can increase, you know. And there are a few things that come to mind. There are three things I'm just going to throw out. Then I'm going to go on pause because I'm going to lose my voice again. The first one that I think of is the Wallace Foundation's Equity-Centered Principal Initiative. I think it's in its like third or fourth year right now. And one of the things that they're doing is they're developing principles, right? They're bringing in principles and developing principles to be equity-centered so that when you get those new teachers and those teachers who already are seasoned teachers, they are able to create an atmosphere that does not have a dichotomy between this and academic achievement. Two more things I wanted to ask about. One is, I think one of the programs that has done this to a great extent is Dr. Moses, the Algebra Project. I don't know if you're familiar with that. And then the third one that I was going to ask about is, because I know when you did one of your examples, you talked about love. And I was wondering if you had thought of CASTLE, the Center for Social Emotional, and Dr. Jagers, who is a very, very good friend and who believes in all of this. But it's more than, in addition to academic achievement, in addition to cultural responsive, it's also social emotional. So I'm just going to put those three out there and see your comments. And my voice is going away, so I'm going to mute.
Well, thank you first of all for coming while you're sick. I appreciate that. And I do hope you feel better. That time of year, unfortunately, between allergies and illnesses. So I do hope you feel better. I agree, and thank you for those resources. The social emotional piece just made me think of they have implemented with some of our later cohorts. They have implemented some of that we call it transformative social emotional. So TCEL is the acronym that we use. And that I would be really curious to maybe think about some research or do some research on how those T-cell approaches pair with this as well in terms of building the capacity of participants. We've done a lot of work now with our participants, but also with the coaches and faculty within our program. So we're thinking about the adults, like social emotional, as well as the students social emotional. And I would be like very curious to see, maybe I'll further my research around T-cell, the work that happens, or social emotional learning and the work work that happens there, and then also this multicultural, because I do think that there's a component of the teacher also doing their work around discovery, multicultural, understanding their, their level of comfort with their own personal biases and multiculturalism as they're stepping into the classroom.
Thank you. Any other questions, reactions? Well, Dr. Holmes, again, thank you so very much. I appreciate you taking the time to share with us. There's a question, do you want a connection with the author? I think that's for you, Dr. Holmes.
No, it's for Tracy. Dr. Holmes knows the author. I was just,
Oh, yeah, that would be
Yeah.
so interesting.
yeah.
Dr.
Okay, fantastic. Dr. Holmes, thank you so much for sharing with us today your work and just your real deep thoughtfulness, not just about the research that you did, but also how does it extend further? Because I think that's really the exciting part at this point. So thank you so much for that. Again, congratulations on the doctorate. That's wonderful. And everyone, I thank you so much for coming out today and listening to this really insightful discussion. Thank you.
Thank you. I appreciate it. Thank you all.
Thanks so much.